different name, and this has served to just confuse us. When all is said and done, to be one's our revolution. We never stand alone, 'cause unity's our...
Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Latimore-Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3o Art of Life show. The title of this show is Black Political Empowerment, a Reality Check. And who could I get in this studio to do a better job of checking on the reality of black political empowerment than Professor Robert Starks, Professor of Political Science at the Northeastern Illinois University Center. Well, actually, it's the Carruthers Center for Inner City Studies, named after the late priest Jacob H. Carruthers. And of course, my old dear friend and colleague and everything else. This is Timuel Black, whose face is familiar to everybody. He's been awarded everything that anybody can award. The last thing I think I heard about was the History Makers. No, that may not be the last thing. The Black United Fund was your last award. Do you have a room in your house where you put all these trophies?
That's what my wife was worried about, having some space to sit down.
I know.
But much of it's been transferred to the Vivian Harsh Archives collection.
In the library, the regional library at 95th and Halsted?
Yeah, at the Carter G. Woodson
The
Library.
Carter G. Woodson,
They have a special section named after the first African-American librarian in the city, Vivian Harsh, who was the first librarian at the George Cleveland Hall Library on 48th Street. And,
followed by Charlie Mae Rollins,
Yeah,
who
Miss
was
Rollins.
my librarian as a child in grammar school, yes. And it's wonderful to be able to know your librarian on a personal level, you know, and know what the librarian is doing that is helping you.
Well, it was a very important meeting place for many of the intellectuals across the country. W.E.B. Du Bois and poet Langston Hughes, the photographer, the great black photographer, I forget his name right off. It was an organizing place.
Gordon Parks.
Yeah, Gordon Park. We would meet, we youngsters would come to the library just to have an opportunity to see these famous people who are already famous and were activists, and particularly during the Great Depression. They were activists. That's reading the Roosevelt Good New Deal did a lot to soften the anger at the United States of America over unemployment and other factors.
What grade school did you go to, Tim, in high school?
Well, you know, the black community was very mobile in those days because we were so cramped. So I started at Fuller.
Okay.
Then I went to Forestville. And Forestville was overcrowded, so we moved, and I went to Willard.
I went to Willard.
And it was overcrowded. So then blacks jumped across what was then Grand Boulevard. And we moved to 50th and Calumet, and I went to Edmund Burke.
Okay.
By that time, I was in second grade.
All right. Okay.
3 schools later, I was
Okay.
in second grade.
Okay.
And that's where I met a lot of important people who became very important, like Bill Green, who was the first black internal revenue agent in the country, and Charles White, a great artist, New Orleans, and on and on. We had.
In your high school, was it Wendell Phillips?
Well, I went to Inglewood first. At Burke, we still had some whites, so we had a choice. The choice was there to go to Phillips, Inglewood, or Hyde Park.
You had that choice?
We had that choice because there were still whites there.
Okay.
And wanted to give them the opportunity to go to Hyde Park, really.
Okay.
Well, I went to Inglewood, and I was there, and the class thing entered the game. Although the white kids who went to Inglewood came from blue-collar backgrounds, like Daly's neighborhood, we should have been going to Phillips. They would ask the black kids, where did their father work? Well, most of the black kids that I grew up with around Burke, their parents, if they were working, were either white collar or professional. My daddy worked in stockyards. So when I would answer the question, people would put their hands up to their nose. So I began to hang out with the wrong people.
Okay.
58th Street gang guys.
Okay.
And now these were not poor guys, but they were just tough guys. Red Fox was a part of that group. And they caught me cutting class, and I gave my right name. Then the assistant principal, who was a bigot, he was going to tell my daddy, my father, who was a tough little guy, he was going to tell my daddy how to punish me. And my father said, this is in the 30s, I pay your salary. You don't pay mine. Now, you're not going to tell me how to treat my children. I knew I was going to get a spanking when I got home, but that wasn't his business. So then I decided, time me to transfer.
Okay.
And I forged my mama's name and went to Phillips.
Oh my
She
goodness.
was angry because she was class oriented.
Okay.
You have to understand the class differentiation.
Right.
And that's what we're dealing with now as we get into this political arena more
Well,
national.
let's open this,
I was
Bob.
going to ask, Tim, when did you meet Anna Langford? Because Anna went to Hyde Park.
She went to Hyde Park.
Right.
But she was in that sort of elitist social group, which my brother was a part of.
Okay.
See, I switched backward and forward. I could go. My brother couldn't go with the tough guys. He didn't know how to handle that. But he hung out with the Anna Langfords and the of that whole social elitist group. They were, they were prepared to move into the mainstream socially as well as academically. And so we all lived in the same neighborhood. See, you could go to Hyde Park. Usually, you'd wind up living in the Grand Boulevard section. That's the area just east of what is now Martin Luther King Drive. Or you would be living in Woodlawn, that patch of Woodlawn where blacks lived before the Hansberry decision. So I knew all those people. I didn't hang out with them too much. I might go to a farm and put on my tux and my tails and play like I was,
one of them.
Whisper to the little girl, let's get out of here.
Well, if we don't get started on this black political empowerment piece in a minute, because you are just a treasure trove of all the most wonderful anecdotes. But
the point is, I'm saying all that to give our viewers a idea of the social composition of that community that laid the groundwork for what the political groundwork for what we see happening today. It was through those interactions and those ambitions that we elected the first black congressman after Reconstruction, Oscar DePriest, or the John Jones was elected to the state county board of the state legislature.
First to the county board and then the state legislature.
John Jones in the 1860s and 70s. That continuum came through the social climate that existed in Chicago, and particularly on the South Side.
Okay.
See, I don't want our readers, our viewers, to believe that all of a sudden
we just and started getting interested in politics.
No, it wasn't that. It had a foundation to build on, because as those people were talking the social talk, they were also talking the political talk. And that's the reason DuSable High School became named the DuSable, because of the Charlemagne Rollins and those people, women who would meet. And when the new building was built, they demanded that it be named after the first non-native to settle in this area that we now call Chicago. That was a political demand. And those downtown had to understand that political demand, because at that time, in the consolidation and the segregation, blacks outvoted, percentage-wise, immigrants from Europe, percentage-wise. And so with that block of voting, our elected officials had to behave like we wanted them to behave, or they'd get fired. I mean, they wouldn't get elected again.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Robert, you are, for a long time, I think you were co-founder, if not the founder, of the task force for black
co-founder.
Task Force for Black Political Empowerment. What was your aim when you got that organization up and running?
Well, our major aim at that point was getting Harold Washington elected.
Okay.
And of course, out of that came a much broader perspective, because what we found out rather quickly was that not only did we have to get him elected, but we had to maintain a base so that he could stay in the office and remain comfortable. And at the same time, we had to help channel the demands of the masses of African Americans to him. Because, as you know, every elected official, particularly black elected officials, sometimes have people around them that are not in tune with everything that's going on in the community. And an elected official can't know everything. He's got to have differing opinions coming back and forth to him, and we serve that purpose. Yeah.
So you can't just elect somebody and then go home.
No, of course not.
You have to stay somewhere in the vicinity so that your needs can be met, or at least they can be known.
Absolutely.
Not just met and known, but demanded.
Okay.
And have the potential. We put the rascals in, we can take the rascals out.
Right.
And they have to understand that.
Right.
And that's a power block that you don't want to use, but they know you can use.
Is it still true, as it once was, that blacks, particularly in the city, had the balance of power that we could decide an election by simply choosing one candidate over the other one because we had the numbers and we could tilt the scale? Is that still true?
That is because of the breakdown of the kinds of organizations, not the lack of proliferation of those kind of organizations like Bob Starks and his team put together, and because of a group coming in that we helped get to the point where they are politically, that is the Latino. That the force is, and because many of our people at the top rung, as Professor Starks has indicated, have been drafted into the conservative power structure, it leaves us less able to make the kinds of victories that we once could take for granted.
I remember your days at the Chicago League of Negro Voters and protests at the polls. I remember your association with Gus Savage and Lemuel Bentley and Al Janney.
Mr. Parks.
Those organizations, I think the Chicago League of Negro Voters was founded in the same way, Bob, to elect the first citywide office, the office of city clerk. We recognize
Lemuel Bentley.
Lemuel Bentley, and we actually racked up more votes than the major political party. We racked up more votes than the Republican candidate. We didn't win the election, but we didn't expect to win the election. We expected to make the statement that we were no longer going to be satisfied with just trying to become the precinct captain, or just some minor, thing in our own communities.
And that laid the groundwork, the citywide effort, and put in the thoughts of people that we almost did it and we can do it.
Right.
Because that was symbol of the possibilities.
And of course, at that time, you were going against the grain of the black elected elite, and headed up at that time by Dawson. Dawson was so entrenched in the Democratic Party machine until he resisted having this group of Tim Black and Bennett Johnson and people like that, Al Janney, they were considered radicals and outside the pale of politics, and
that's the way they would get. That's the way we would get labeled.
Well, we considered ourselves
Insinuating
Right.
like we were members of the far left.
Right.
Say all we want to do is be good Americans.
That's
right.
right.
And we considered ourselves to be independents.
Oh yes.
We're not owned by any party.
Exactly.
So we were
Exactly.
likely to change our minds according to where we saw our best interests.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think Leon Dupre was regarded as almost honorary in terms of what the principles and the positions that he took on issues were the kinds of positions we wanted taken on issues. So it had that other flavor of we didn't vote for the candidate because the candidate was black.
That's right.
We voted for the candidate because the candidate represented and respected black people.
And we voted down 2 black candidates that ran against Leon Dupre. Our votes in the 5th Ward. Two candidates who came out of the machine purposely. Another fact about Leon, we would say, in kind of sarcastic way, there's only one black man in
the city council, and it was Leon Dupre.
He's a white man. And at a conference when I was running for, at a press conference when I was running for the against Claude Holman in 1963, which was again a test. They were asking, why do you call them the Silent Six? And I said, because they engage in plantation politics. And that was a phrase that kind of got used probably
yes,
across the
it
country.
did.
It's become a part of the political lexicon. Absolutely, absolutely.
But the things that Bob Starks and that group did to help elect Harold were phenomenal. I don't know whether Harold would have been welcome in the projects or not. But they took him there, and he was welcome because of the connections,
Right.
which Bob's organization, relatively
The
young people
grassroots.
from them, they had been organizing that way. And so when you look at the figures, see, Harold only won by 49,000 votes
That's right.
Really?
That's right.
That close?
every time, even running against a Republican. 49,000. It was that turnout in the housing developments that created the massive difference.
Right.
And you can see now why it was important for Richard Daley, when he came to office in 1989, to destroy the public housing, okay? Because he didn't want the ability of that kind of uprising again. So, and secondly, he changed the method by which mayors are elected. Instead of the a party election, it's now a nonpartisan election, so that anybody can run and he can hedge his bets and probably win, as long as it's fixed the way it is. But remember, Harold did the in-between. You had 2 whites, and he ran between the 2 of them in a primary. And once you won the primary in Chicago, the Democratic
But the
primary,
Democratic Party didn't really support Harold.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't. But that he understood that there was really only one party in Chicago, and that was the Democratic Party. And so since Daley was running against Byrne, he ran the in-between. So Daley said, I'll never let that happen again. So they went to the state legislature and changed from a party election of the mayor to a nonpartisan election. And that of course, was done directly to dilute the power of the African American vote.
So where do we have voter education so we can learn these things? Because, people who vote just think business continues as usual. We don't notice these things, these changes that are being made that give advantages. We certainly, I think sometimes it may be brought to our attention that a line has been moved so that you now are not in this ward, but you're in another ward. That kind of gerrymandering you hear about, where they deliberately position a ward so that it cannot cannot elect a certain candidate because of the makeup of the ward, that kind of thing.
The other thing he did, which I thought was rather slick on his part, was to change the way in which the composition of the Chicago School Board. Remember, we used to mount phenomenal campaigns against the Chicago School Board when it was a real school board. Now, of course, it is run directly by the mayor from his office.
Really?
It's taken over.
Totally controls it.
Taken
And
over.
that he did in 1989. He used the reform efforts that was begun by Harold Washington in 87 before he passed away, and used that as a wedge to change it to a total control by the mayor's office. And
Well,
that's what he has now.
As many problems as we have had as a result of the
boy.
school situation in every respect, and we have always been the majority, our students have always been the majority of the students in the Chicago Public Schools. Why is it that we are not interested in these kinds of things, knowing that we don't have a school board that makes any decisions, knowing that we don't actually exercise or exert any influence over the fate of our children sitting in the public schools? What is the reason? What about our aldermen? We still had a silent six
What
down?
we still have, the numbers are bigger. The tone is the same.
Okay,
They're still more than silent in many ways because they can be obstructionists
okay.
in some ways. But the population of the schools today is very much different than they were even 2 decades or 3 decades ago. Most of the people in your generations, their children either don't go to public schools or they go to specialized public schools.
Charter
to prove
schools or
char-
academies and all these fancy names.
Magnet schools.
Magnet, yeah.
They go to very selected. Fewer than somewhere around 2% of the teachers in Chicago public schools send their children who have children eligible to Chicago public school.
Yes, that's deplorable.
Isn't that something?
That's deplorable.
That's
so they
deplorable.
they don't.
Absolutely.
Now, the other factor comes at the national level, where the president gets a bill or gets an edict or whatever it might be, leave no child behind. And the leave no child behind focuses almost completely on standardized tests. And black kids do not do well on standardized tests unless they're reared in an environment where the standardized test has evolved.
Because standardized tests are culturally biased.
Absolutely.
And of course,
And they are stacked.
you studied that, did research on it, and actually came up with an alternate test yourself when you were at Northeastern. You know about that, of course.
So, you know, that's a stacked deck.
That's a stacked deck, intentionally stacked,
Of course.
because they want to say they're not smart enough when they make application to the elite colleges and universities and things. And then their counselors do not guide them toward the 2-year schools or to your Northeastern University Center for Inner City Studies.
Right, precisely.
And or even Chicago State in many ways. Given the numbers, the volume, those would be preparatory schools for the future in terms of the future of going. Another factor that came in with Harold, however, was not just the division between Daley and Byrne. Was after Harold had defeated Daley and Byrne, had won the primary, a white Republican,
Bernie
Upton ran against him, and he only won by about the same numbers, 49 or 50,000, that he won in a Democratic city. Race does matter.
But remember the mantra that was issued on Mr. Upton's behalf by Mr. Podolyak: before it's too late. That was a code word.
And with his picture.
Where's
Well, you know,
Fetcher?
for me, Bernie Epton represented the Sarah Palin
Yes.
of today because he was completely inept. And he could not put two sentences together that made any sense at all. But it was just the fact that there was a mouth that was moving in a white face that had people listening to him.
He had quite a bit of money. He once proposed buying the White House. Now, I had his children at Hyde Park High School. They were bitterly angry at their dad, you know, because of his position, because they knew it was race. They bitterly angry at him because, you know, Hyde Park kind of had a mixed population, and, except for the lower level.
Right. And he had represented a part of Hyde Park in the state legislature.
That's right. That's right.
Right. And he allowed
But he was a
himself to
Republican.
be, he was a Republican, and allowed himself to be used by the Vidoliaks and those people in that. The other thing about the school board, which again I think Tim and of course the group that when Tim was working in the public schools understood explicitly, was that the public schools were really, in addition to being, you know, an educational institution, it was also a political football. And
Absolutely.
Thirdly, it was a place for employment. It was used as a place for employment. And Daley understood that explicitly because he, you know, when he took over control of it, he then used it as a dumping ground for all of his political cronies. Secondly, it became a contract place where he could give contracts out to all of his friends. And then, of course, with the so-called local school councils, he could hire and fire principals at will, when in fact, under the old system, it was a very difficult thing to do. So he came in and took advantage of that reform movement that caught fire in the 86, 87, and used it to his own advantage.
I was appalled to learn that the teachers' strikes were not in fact teachers' strikes. That when teachers were out on strike, there were at least a dozen other unions who, if they did not agree to the terms of the settlement, the schools could not reopen. It didn't matter if teachers decided that they didn't care about how much of a pay raise, or they were willing to concede certain things and go back in, because most teachers had the students' interest at heart. And they didn't really want to be on strike, and they certainly didn't want to be on strike any longer than it was absolutely necessary. But these other unions, when you talk about the political football, you had all these other unions who had a vested interest in getting more for their union members, and consequently, if they would not come to the table in agreement, the teachers could not. And I said, why are they calling this the teacher strike?
Well,
because there are 13 other unions who are sitting, who have to come to an agreement before the schools can be reopened.
Well, they are part of the Chicago, what is the Chicago Labor Council?
The Chicago Labor Council.
Right. Which includes not only the teachers, but the
firemen,
all these people.
And some of those people would be
staff.
selected to be on school board from those. Now, going back just a little bit, however, to your reference of the black vote being the balance of power, it was the balance of power, because at one time we voted some more independently. But in 1936, when Dawson, who was a Republican, convinced his precinct captains, meeting at the old 8th Regiment Armory, and he had been convinced by Kelly of the Kelly Nash machine before Daley, in order to bring, to help Roosevelt win, that they had to go to the Democratic Party. Now you got the Good New Deal operating in that. And so blacks went over to the Democratic Party and have never used the base of that power to make demands, threats that they could go to any party and make a difference. And so we have been taken for granted by both parties. One party said we're not going to get them. Other parties say we got them.
So 36 was, by most political scientists, is considered the year of the transfer from loyalty to the Republican Party to the beginning of the changeover to Democratic loyalty on the part of African American voters.
See, if we had a switch, if we had the kind of leadership that said, this is where you got to go because, this is where you got to go because, and give some concrete reasons, then both parties would have to have a great deal more respect and willingness to be more fair to the black community, which created the wealth of this city, the wealth of this nation. On our backs
Right.
was built the wealth
Right.
of this nation.
But you brought up that magic word, leadership. You know, leadership, where is it? Where has it been?
We have created the leaders, but then we have not made demands that the leaders follow the demands and needs of the community that elected them. So they feel free to bargain for themselves with the powers that have the resources to meet the unmet needs. And so once they're elected, their assumption is they're going to either vote for me or nobody. And so the options that used to exist of switching backward and forward are no longer available.
Why are we so prone to be loyal to people who clearly are not representing our interests? Because the major issues that come up in every election anywhere has to do with better schools and better jobs and better housing and better, you know, they talk about the things that are nearest and dearest to people's hearts, the basic needs that people need to have met. And they make these promises, and yet the schools, the public schools, continue to deteriorate, in my opinion. We do not do better in terms of employment. The unemployment rates continue to rise. So if we keep electing people who keep making promises that they don't make, is it our fault or theirs? If the dog bites you once, it's the dog's fault. If he bites you twice, it's yours.
Yes. See, once upon a time, much of our leadership originated in our religious institutions.
Okay.
And those religious institutions existed as independents because they didn't need the outside help. The congregation could, right? They were educational, they were not political, but politicians wanted them all the way. Now those institutions have been, in many cases, taken over,
Co-opted
by the establishment on the
with
basis
the ham
of
and
personal,
the turkey for Christmas and Thanksgiving.
more than that for some.
But we have a new phenomenon now. It's the new black elite, which is the post-civil rights leadership, which does not have the empathy, if you will, or not really the experience, because they don't understand. I mean, they didn't come through the 1960s. And we've got to make sure that they understand where they came from, how they got to where they are, and that they can never forget that.
And their obligation.
And their obligation to perpetuate that history and those obligations. Because many of them, unfortunately, think that they just fell out of the sky and all whole and you know, everything is fine and dandy. And even to the extent that some of our young people are now calling this era a post-racial era, which is just appalling. There's no such thing.
And yet when they get up into the structure, they find that the treatment that they receive is similar to the treatment that their grandmas and grandpas crowd about. But the rewards that they're getting are for them so magnificent, and their indebtedness that they create keeps them from organizing with themselves as the old leadership would organize. and therefore they're isolated in their potential to be leaders.
Well, it may be a
and they're-
post-racial era, but it's not a post-racist era.
they-
We still have racism, and
Precisely.
you know, it may be however subtle it may be, however they have something called low intensity aggression, so that when you are being victimized, it is so subtle that you don't recognize it until it's far
late.
too late for you to
unless you've
have a
experienced
remedy.
it. You
Right.
see, and those in my generation, regards to where they went, they experienced
Mm-hmm.
the racism. They had to come back to the community and cry on somebody's shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
These youngsters don't have any shoulders they feel like they can come back to.
Well, we don't have community, Tim.
That's the big point, you see. That sense of community
Mm-hmm.
has been lost. When we look at the going forward, we look at the present presidential race.
Mm-hmm.
They don't say it, but it is insinuated into the conversations or into the advertisements, insinuated into that race, that here is somebody who is not Caucasian running for this big office. And the only reason is because he's pleading. They insinuate all that. So those who have been around a long time, we know it when it hits. And maybe the younger generation may not. And then there's another part of our yesterday I was talking with riding with a young man, trying to pick up my wife. And I asked him, I said, now I'm sure you're registered and you're going to vote. He said, no, I'm not registered. And I'm not going to vote. I said, why not? He said, it doesn't make any difference. That's a good section of the population. That's the population that Bob and them brought out. You see? It doesn't make any difference. And then Zenobi went on to tell him about South Africa. He said that it showed he wasn't uninformed. He went on to deal with the change from Mandela to Mbeki. And he knew something about the poverty level of those at the bottom who elected Mandela and waited for hours. He knew that story. And they're down at the bottom still. Their life has not improved, hardly at all for most of them. And so the crime is in Joburg and all that.
One of the most crime-ridden countries in the world. And as he said, Joburg is just, and Cape Town are just bereft with crime, killings, murder, robbery, rape, etc.
Well, you know,
because
you
of the
can't
poverty.
allow anything that is controlled or headed up by black people to succeed, or else black people might get the idea that they can control, that they can run something, that they can succeed, that they can set goals and reach them. And it seems to me that the only arena in which we get less interference, overt interference, is in the churches. You know, now we can build a mammoth church. You know, we can do that, and we can put a school next door, and we can put some housing. You know, we can do a lot of stuff in that arena.
But Dr. Peace, the kinds of churches that are the mammoth, big churches, the mega churches, are basically the kinds of churches that preach economic prosperity rather than a civil rights kind of gospel, the kind that we used to hear on Sundays in the church in the 1960s. Most of the mega churches are people who preach prosperity, and that's welcome. The masses, I mean, the majority of Americans love that, because that doesn't really deal with any of the crucial problems that we face.
And it creates a fantasy
Of course.
for them. Now,
And
if
it
you get
feeds
no-
into capitalism, the whole
Yeah,
notion
well,
of
it gives you
capitalism.
the idea that you can pull yourself up by your
Precisely.
bootstraps.
Gives you
You know,
that.
you get the Horatio Alger
There you
thing,
go.
you know, from rags to riches.
Right.
That's the theme that you can, and that they then sell on an individual basis, which divides again the group. Now, if you get a church like Reverend Jeremiah Wright, where many of those young people in that church have been out in the world. They're educated for the most part. And you get a minister like him who is a militant. Now you have to just try to politically destroy that guy. You see? Father Flager on the other side, who he has a different kind of congregation, but preaches the same kind of sermons. You have to belittle those and keep the politicians aware if they're going to get elected and have the select position, they better stay away from.
But a T.D. Jakes or Creflo Dollar can be as prosperous as possible and have as many people because they don't threaten the system. That's my point.
And they don't bring the culture into the building. You know, we're not going to Africa. We're not interested in what's going on in Africa. We're only interested in what's going on in our own individual lives.
And they're not mobilizing people the way Dr. King did, you know, to challenge the system in which people find themselves in.
But Tim said a little bit ago that, you know, we are generating these leaders, that we're creating these leaders. The leaders are coming out of us. So have we changed? Are we sending forth leaders that are no longer recognizable as having come from us? You know, we've got this long legacy of struggle and efforts to survive and overcoming and whatnot. And now we have people who have not had that experience, and they obviously don't think that experience has any value because they don't seem to relate to it in any meaningful way.
History, or they don't know that history. And if you don't know your history, the chances are you're going to repeat the negative aspects of that history. And that is what is happening in the corporate world, even with the so-called people who thought they were different leaders. They were going to be examples of what you can be. They're the first ones being dumped in the capital, in the big world, the $200,000 and $300,000 a year world, that gave them the impression that they could be billionaires. And you see on the television, you see billionaire Oprah Winfrey and on. Or you can be like that because she looks like you. They hardly even know the history of Oprah Winfrey and her struggle in growing up. They just almost believe that she started where she is. No. They don't know the history of Michael Jordan and the struggles in North Carolina that he made it. They think he all of a sudden was where he was when they saw him jump in the air and dunk a ball. And those are the fantasies that many of our younger people particularly are either you find them giving up and saying, I'm not going to make it. Like this young man said, it doesn't matter who's in there. Or other young people that people like Bob and I talk with who don't believe they're going to live very long. So they have no feelings for it. And it takes the inspiration of the religious or the political or the social who can say, who to you, if you just keep on, you can do that. But you owe it to the group. You owe it to the community of which you're a part. When you see your down the street neighbor, you say, thank you. We don't have the cohesion or the coherence in our communities that existed even a generation ago. So the kind of base of power has to come from a charismatic, self-sacrificing. Dr. King did not have to be out there getting bombed and shot at. He could have been the top of a corporation. That anyone that he wanted. He could have been president of almost any university he wanted. They wanted to get him out of there. But his commitment was to the people. Now there are many of us at a lesser level who the system said, come on in here. Come on in here. And then you won't have to worry about anything. And someone said, I ain't going there. I remember Richard J. did it. When they booed him off the stage, he sent, he had the executive director of the Human Relations Council call me. Because the rumor was that it was done, what's his name, John, what's his name, from out east, political science. He'll be in here in a couple of weeks.
Oh, John Bracey.
Yeah, John Bracey. These guys that organized that booing booed him off the stage.
In Grant Park.
And booed Jackson, Joe Jackson.
Joe Jackson.
Off the stage. And so someone rumored that this was done because of the way I'd been treated in the election. He had this chairman, this guy that called me, the mayor wants to see you. I said, yeah. I said, tell him we'll be there. He said, no, the mayor wants to see you. I said, I told you to tell him we'll be there. I was not going to see the mayor by myself so that he could make the story. Now, there are others that we extol as so-called leaders who did go to see the mayor by themselves after they had organized a group of people to go with them in 2 or 3 buses. They went up to see the mayor by himself. Out there, he could see the potential power base. In here, he could talk about, if you don't do anything with that power base, here's what you will get. And then you can measure it from where they were when they first went there to where they may be
Where
now.
they
I'm
were.
not going to name any names.
You don't have to name
But
any
that's-
names. You think I
but
don't know
that's-
our history?
That's the problem that and see, because we did not ever we never did, it wasn't in our style to punish those who betrayed us.
Yeah, yeah,
see.
yeah.
We would reward them, but don't punish them. And if you don't have those sanctions that he or she understands,
Right.
then they feel free because they can come on back to you and get pity once they're dumped, when they're no longer needed. That is not true in almost any other community.
That's true.
Particularly, the most dramatic would be the most dramatic would be the Italian community.
Yeah.
They have sanctions.
Right. You know, I think we have to take off the gloves, and we have to say that we know that electing a single individual to a single office, no matter how powerful and prestigious that office is, does not change the lot of the black community. It takes more than
Precisely.
electing an individual
Right.
to an office. For example, the presidency. The president is the president, the executive part of the government. But there is the legislative and the judicial. And we certainly ought to understand that when people stand before us and they say what they're going to do, we need to understand whether or not they can, in fact, do what they say they're going to do. We have a Senate and a House of Representatives. They allegedly make the laws.
That is true.
Allegedly, there are lobbyists who are courting them all the time,
With big bucks.
trying to
behind
make certain that the laws they make don't affect the profits of these companies the lobbyists work for.
Precisely.
So the reality is that it takes more than just voting somebody into an office. It takes vigilance. It takes knowledge. You have to know. You have to not only investigate and research to find out what is going on, but you also have to be a part of some sort of organization that can act not as your little individual self, but as the Task Force for Black Political Empowerment that can act, can find out what is going on, what is being proposed to go on, and can make the effort to run interference or set it aright if it goes off track. The naivete that the electorate, and I'm not just thinking of black people, the electorate has, that you just elect this person as your senator,
And
as
then
your
go home.
whatever, and this person is going to go in and change the whole thing.
No.
It wouldn't be a government
Right.
If it was just all you needed to do was have one individual, you could just have one individual. You wouldn't need all these other people. So what kinds of steps do we need to take? Certainly we need some classes. People need to. Why do we care about political empowerment anyway? Why? Your young man said it doesn't make any difference one way or the other. Does it make a difference?
Absolutely, because decisions about his life and where he is are going to be made.
What kind of decisions about his life?
Well,
everything.
Everything. Work opportunities.
Okay.
He's working in a menial job with his intelligence. I didn't find out where he went to school, but he certainly had information. Where he's going to live, what kind of health care he's going to get, if any. What kind of safety is going to be in the community. Isn't it tragic to see what happened
Absolutely.
in Inglewood, the people in that family?
Absolutely.
What kind of that is unlikely to happen in almost any other neighborhood.
Right.
And the people in the neighborhood said, we heard the shots, but it wasn't nothing unusual. So we just thought it was, some
more of the gang activity.
They had no
Because it
idea.
happens all the time. The man said, we hear gunshots almost every day. Every day.
So police protection, we're
Oh, absolutely.
wanting in those terms. So politics determines, what did Lou Palmer say, who gets what, where, when, and under what conditions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
somebody is determining your destiny. Somebody is deciding your fate that you have never met and maybe don't even know how they fit into the grand scheme of things.
Appreciation.
When I was active politically, I discovered that people didn't even know what a ward committeeman did.
Appreciation.
They didn't know what an alderman did. They just knew these people were, they went to the city council and they made speeches. But they didn't really know what if you had potholes in the street, or if you had absence of trees or diseased trees, you didn't know who to call. You didn't know about departments in the city, sanitation and all of this. If you had snow up to your front porch, you just had the snow. You didn't know that there was somebody whose case you were supposed to be on to see that you got city services.
See, now that's where the generational gap and lack of knowledge of political power comes. Because in my childhood, in the neighborhood where I grew up, those things were part of our daily. We'd have dinner or breakfast or whatever, and the mamas and daddies would begin to talk about what's happening in the neighborhood, the potholes, the protection and all that. We children are listening. How do you get the job done? How do you get the work done? And even in the teenage years, we knew how to go put people back in who had been evicted from their houses.
Right.
That was part of our social responsibility to do that.
And we would notice when there were people working in our community and we had people who weren't.
Exactly.
Folks coming in a
That's right.
truck, they digging stuff in the streets and they doing all these things. And we don't, but daddy don't have a job.
And all that.
So we
And the
have to get involved.
And the schools are not doing, and the public schools are not doing, preparing,
Right.
Even the schools. The homes are different in many ways because, again, days of my years, 80 to 85% of all children under 19 lived in two-parent households. But if they didn't live in two-parent households, the neighborhood, it takes a village to raise a child. That idea that she borrowed from African culture.
And brought a book.
And that the children in the neighborhood belong to the neighbors in the neighborhood. So there was a kind of a discipline. Now, after World War II,
You got 2 minutes to go from after World War II to
real
today.
quick, after World War II, the population changed.
Okay.
And the neighborhoods changed.
The whole culture changed, too.
And the whole culture changed.
Yeah.
So we got 2 wars. We've got our young men who are over there fighting to defend the country.
Right.
We have a very promising presidential candidate. Ought we to be expecting something better than we saw after all the other wars and all the other elections? Do we have a right, or is there something we need to do, Bob?
I think we need to become even more active, even more vigilant. We need to be supportive on the one hand, but also demanding and vigilant on the other. As you stated earlier, it's not a time to vote and then go home and get under the covers. It's now time to become active, because if indeed we are going to take advantage of the things that will be provided through a President Obama, we have to be organized to take advantage of those things. I'm sure he will have some programs that will be beneficial to the African American community, but only if those groups in those communities are organized to take advantage of them. We know that the other communities are already organized and they are ready. And in fact, they've already put their demands on the table. We have not put our demands on the table.
Because we don't have the access to others. When we look at the others and see what ethnic or racial groups they come from, they are usually selectees that come out of the political organization that exists in Chicago, particularly Chicago represent. They come out of the organization, or they have been the beneficiaries of the struggles.
We have got to change.
Absolutely.
We have got to change.
Or else we're going to go down.
You know, obviously, if this is the change agent, if now is the time for the change, we've got to change with the times.
Absolutely.
And we've got to, as you say, we've got to be organized, and we've got to know what it is we want, and then we've got to demand it and be prepared to impose sanctions if we don't get what we know we're entitled to and what we need and deserve.
And we know that some people are going to go in on individual agendas. But we've got to have a group agenda, a collective agenda that outweighs many of those little petty individual agendas. Because every president, every elected official, every leader is inundated by personal agendas and people constantly begging for give me this, give me that. But as a group of people, we've got to have some collective agenda that speaks to the crying needs of African Americans in this country and African people and the rest of the African diaspora.
And we can justify that by saying that what's good for us is good for all Americans. We are good Americans. We're not being anti-American. We're trying to be good Americans. And the person that I'm supporting is a good American. And if he is elected and acts like a good American, it will be inclusive of all Americans, rather than selective and rejective, particularly of those who were responsible for helping initiate his rise to the top.
Thank you, Timuel Black.
We're all going to vote on November 4th.
Oh, yes, regardless.
I've already voted. What do you mean on November 4th? If you waiting to shoot,
It's going to be crowded.
The lines have already.
Oh, you're going to wait in a long line. Well, I've already voted.
I want to go get in the line just to see how it feels to be in.